Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that you might not think is a big deal.
Okay.
Bird flu.
Oh,
But stick with us because it's actually super relevant, especially with some recent developments here in the U.S. When we talk about bird flu, we're specifically honing in on the H5N1 strain.
yeah.
And get this, almost half of all documented H5N1 cases globally have been in kids under 18.
Wow.
That's pretty wild, right? So we got some really interesting sources lined up today. We've got global overviews. We're going to look at insights into symptoms, how it spreads, and even what the CDC is doing to keep a watchful eye on everything.
Very interesting. So, the interesting thing about this is that while we're talking about bird flu,
Okay.
the numbers kind of tell a story that goes beyond just birds. Since 1997, there have been roughly 900 confirmed cases of H5N1 globally.
900 cases. That doesn't sound like a lot, but I get the feeling there's more to it.
I mean, it's not about the total number, but really where these cases are concentrated.
Okay.
If you look at a country like Egypt, for example, they've had a significant number of cases, with 68 of those being just in children.
Just in children.
And what's really concerning is that the age group that's most affected is 0 to 5 years old.
Wow, so those are the really little ones.
Exactly. So it seems like younger children are particularly susceptible to this specific strain of bird flu.
That is concerning. So we've got this kind of global picture. But what about here in the U.S.? What's going on in our own backyard?
Well, while most cases around the world have been mild,
Okay.
there have been some severe cases even in developed nations, like Canada, for example. There was just recently a teenager in Canada who became critically ill from an H5N1 infection.
Oh, wow.
So it really highlights the potential for this virus to change and to adapt. And that's why the CDC is really laser focused on monitoring what's going on here in the U.S.
I can see why that would set off some alarm bells. So what exactly is the CDC doing to stay ahead of this?
Well, they're taking a multi-pronged approach,
Oh.
really using a variety of different methods to track the virus. One really interesting method they're using is wastewater surveillance.
Wastewater surveillance.
Yeah, they're actually testing the sewage for traces of the virus. It might sound a little strange, but it's actually a really effective way to track how the virus is spreading within communities. In addition to that, they're monitoring individuals who may have been exposed to infected birds. They're even analyzing data from emergency rooms.
Wow, so they're really covering all the bases.
Exactly.
Over 7,300 people monitored since March 2024. That's impressive. So they're not messing around. But with all this monitoring in place, are there any new cases popping up?
Well, there is some breaking news.
Okay.
The U.S. just confirmed its first case of H5N1 bird flu in a child in Alameda County, California.
A child?
Yes. This brings the total number of cases in the U.S. to 55 this year, with California accounting for 29 of those.
Oh.
And what's unusual about this case is that the child had no known contact with any infected animals.
Wait, no contact with animals. But isn't that how bird flu usually spreads? This is starting to sound like a mystery.
It is, and that's why this case is so intriguing. CDC is still investigating, how this could have happened, but it certainly raises concerns about other ways that this virus might be spreading.
Okay, I have to admit, I'm officially hooked. But before we get too deep into that, I think we should talk about, the big question.
Yeah.
With this new case, and especially one with no known animal contact, should people be worried?
It's understandable to be concerned, but it is important to emphasize that the CDC still considers the risk to the general public to be low.
Okay.
And even in this recent case, there's no evidence of person-to-person spread.
That's good to hear. I think it would still be helpful to talk about the symptoms of bird flu and how it typically spreads, just so everyone listening has a clear understanding of, what we're dealing with here.
Absolutely. So let's start with the symptoms. Bird flu can actually show up in different ways, ranging from mild to severe. You might experience some familiar symptoms, like fever, cough, fatigue.
So like a common cold or flu?
Yeah, things you might associate with a regular cold or flu.
So if I'm feeling under the weather, how can I tell if it's just a cold or something more serious like bird flu?
Well, there are a few things that set bird flu apart. You might experience some less typical symptoms like diarrhea, nausea, or even redness in your eyes.
Redness in your eyes. Interesting.
And here's something that might surprise you. Not everyone with bird flu actually gets a fever.
Oh, really?
So if you've been around birds and you're feeling off, it's always best to play it safe and see a doctor.
Good reminder. So let's talk about how this virus actually goes from birds to humans. What are the typical ways it spreads?
Well, the most common route is through direct contact with infected birds, particularly poultry.
Okay.
This could involve handling sick or dead birds, cleaning their cages, or even just being in environments that are contaminated with their droppings.
So people who work on poultry farms or have backyard chickens, they're at a higher risk, I would imagine.
Yeah,
But what about the rest of us who aren't really around birds on a regular basis?
you can actually also get infected through what's called environmental exposure, even if you're not directly handling the birds. This basically means inhaling tiny virus particles that are in the air or dust where infected birds have been.
So even if you're just passing through an area where they've been, there's a chance.
There's a slight chance, yeah.
Wow. Okay, so it's not just about avoiding direct contact with birds. It's about being mindful of the places they might be.
Exactly. And there are a couple of other less common ways the virus can spread, such as through contact with what we call intermediary animals.
Intermediary animals.
These are animals that can essentially carry the virus between birds and humans.
Okay.
Remember those dairy cows we talked about earlier?
Like the dairy cows.
They can actually play a role in transmitting the virus.
Wow. It's amazing how interconnected everything is. You know, this seems like a good place to kind of pause for a moment.
I agree.
We've laid a good foundation for understanding bird flu, but there's so much more to uncover, especially in light of that recent case in California and what it means for all of us. You know, that California case really has me thinking, if that child wasn't around infected birds, how did they get sick?
Yeah, it really highlights, just how much we still don't fully understand about this virus and how it behaves.
Yeah, it's like we're piecing together this puzzle, but we're still missing a few key pieces.
Right.
And it makes you wonder what other sources of exposure might be out there, lurking in our everyday lives. We can't exactly live in bubbles. And avoid all contact with the outside world.
True, and it's not about, becoming hermits and avoiding all contact with nature. It's more about just being aware of the potential for indirect contact.
Okay.
Think about all the places where birds hang out.
Yeah.
Parks, beaches, your own backyard even.
Right.
So just being mindful of those shared spaces.
Okay, you've officially got me thinking twice about my weekend plans. But seriously, what can people actually do to minimize their risk? Especially with this new information about potential unknown sources of exposure.
Well, the CDC is pretty clear that good hygiene practices are really key.
Okay, so the basics.
Yes, washing your hands frequently with soap and water, especially after being outdoors or handling anything that might have come into contact with birds.
So it's all about those basic hygiene habits we've been hearing about forever, but maybe just with a renewed focus on when we might encounter bird flu.
Exactly, just being extra cautious in those situations. And if you do have to handle birds, for whatever reason, whether it's for work or for pleasure, always wear the right protective gear like gloves and a mask.
Good reminders. What about for those of us who aren't around birds regularly? Is there anything else we should be thinking about?
This is where it gets really interesting. Remember those rare cases of human-to-human transmission we talked about?
Yeah.
While it's not common, it is a possibility, particularly within households or among people who've been in very close contact with someone who has bird flu.
So even if I'm not directly exposed to birds, if someone in my house gets sick, I could potentially be at risk. What should people do if someone in their home comes down with bird flu?
Well, the CDC recommends isolating the sick person as much as possible, ideally in a separate room and bathroom if you have that option. Wearing a mask when you're interacting with them, and disinfecting frequently touched surfaces regularly.
That all makes sense, but it really highlights how, something like bird flu, even if it starts with birds, could quickly impact our daily lives.
Absolutely. And while the overall risk to the general public is still considered low, it's just a good reminder that we need to stay vigilant and informed because, this situation can change rapidly.
And speaking of changing, let's talk about the virus itself. We've mentioned its potential to adapt. But what does that really mean? Why is that such a big concern?
Well, viruses, especially RNA viruses like influenza, are constantly changing. They're mutating.
Yeah.
It's in their nature. And sometimes these mutations can actually affect the virus's ability to infect different hosts, including us humans.
So it's like the virus is constantly trying on new outfits to see what fits best.
That's a great way to put it. And the big worry is that if this virus mutates in a way that makes it easier to spread between humans, then we could be looking at a much bigger outbreak, potentially even pandemic.
Now I'm starting to really understand why the CDC's monitoring efforts are so important. It's like they're in a race against time, trying to stay one step ahead of this constantly evolving virus.
Exactly. And it's a global effort. Scientists around the world are collaborating, sharing information and resources to try and crack this code. It really highlights just how interconnected we all are when it comes to these global health threats.
It's like we're all part of this delicate web, and one small change in one part of the web can ripple out and affect everything else.
That's a great analogy, and that's why this One Health approach that the CDC is taking is so important.
Yeah.
They recognize that human, animal, and environmental health are all connected.
Okay.
And we need to consider all of those factors to develop truly effective strategies for preventing and controlling diseases like bird flu.
I feel like we've covered so much ground today. From those concerning statistics about children to the CDC's monitoring efforts and the possibility of the virus mutating.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But with knowledge comes power. The more we understand about bird flu, the better equipped we'll be to protect ourselves and our communities.
Absolutely.
So to help our listeners kind of process all this information, let's take a moment to really highlight the key takeaways from our conversation today.
Okay. I think the biggest takeaway is that even though the risk to the general public is considered low, we can't just ignore it.
Yeah.
This isn't something that's only happening over there. It's a global issue, and it has the potential to affect all of us.
Yeah.
We've seen cases in various parts of the world, and this virus is really good at changing and adapting.
And we've learned that the CDC is on top of things, using all sorts of different ways to monitor what's going on here in the U.S., from tracking potential exposure to looking at the virus's genetic makeup.
Right.
They're really taking a comprehensive approach, taking into account human, animal, and environmental health, which is really impressive.
It is. But even with these robust systems in place, that recent case in California where the child got sick without any known contact with infected birds is a bit of a wake-up call.
It is.
It shows us that there's still a lot we don't know about this virus and how it spreads.
It's like a medical mystery trying to figure out how that transmission happened.
Exactly. And it just underscores the importance of ongoing research and surveillance.
Yeah.
We need to constantly be updating our understanding and adapting our response as we learn more.
So what's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with today? What's that final thought you want them to ponder?
Well, given that case with no known animal contact, I think the most important question is, what other potential sources of bird flu exposure should we be aware of in our daily lives?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. It really encourages us to think critically about our surroundings and, how we interact with the world around us.
It's not about living in fear, but about being informed and proactive. We all have a role to play in protecting public health. And by staying informed, practicing good hygiene, and just being aware of our surroundings, we can all contribute to a safer, healthier world.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to continue your own deep dive into this fascinating and ever-evolving topic. Don't forget to check out the show notes for links to all the sources we talked about today. Until next time, stay curious.